It's really, really great to be with you guys. I just want to echo a lot of what Scott said. Thank you so much. It's been an incredible summer. I've learned a lot from Scott. You guys have a great one. He is the greatest teacher around, and I've grown a lot from him. But I've also just grown a lot from you guys, and I'm going to miss you guys a lot. It's been really great. So that being said, I do have some good news. I'm coming back next summer. So thank you. So yeah, you can't get rid of me that easily. But I still feel like I have a lot to learn from Scott, but I also feel like I have a lot to gain from just being around you guys. You guys have modeled to me very well what a church family looks like, and I really, really appreciate that. It's been an incredible summer. So, like Scott said, it's the final sermon in the Interrupted series. We have been in this series this is our 12th week, which is pretty crazy. We've been in this series for the entire summer. It's been a lot of fun. I personally have really enjoyed it. And in this series, we've looked at all sorts of interruptions, right? Specifically revolving around Jesus and the Gospel of Mark. So we've seen Jesus be interrupted by people. We've seen Jesus create interruptions for himself. We've seen Jesus be the one doing the interrupting of somebody else's life. But there's been one type of interruption that we have not looked at yet. So I'm going to tell a quick story to explain what I mean. On May 26th, I preached my first sermon here, May 26th of this summer. That was also my very first Sunday morning sermon ever. So it was a really, really exciting moment. I'd had lots of some cool teaching opportunities at my home church, but mostly with the youth group, and those were really great. But that was my first time being up in front of the whole church Sunday morning, and it was really cool. And I'm sure most of you know this from conversations. I want to be a preacher full-time. I want to be a minister full-time. So that was supposed to be kind of a cool accomplishment moment in my ministry career, a first step. And so I was looking forward to, after that, just fellowshipping with you guys and kind of celebrating that achievement and that accomplishment in my ministry. But instead, once I got down from the stage after I preached, I received a phone call from my dad. And on that phone call, my dad told me that while I was preaching, my grandfather had passed away. And I remember the room started to spin, and it felt like reality was kind of crashing down around me. And I went into that closet over there, and I cried for a good bit. And I let it all out. And instead of wanting to come out and be with you guys, I really just wanted to be with my mom and dad in that moment. Death is the single greatest interruption that we face in our lives. And there's a lot of reasons for this. If you remember back to the sermon, the contents of that sermon on May 26th, I was talking about interruptions that if we would like to, we could avoid if we chose to. And I said, now, there's interruptions out there that we can't avoid. We'll talk about those eventually. Well, today is eventually, because death is the interruption that we can't avoid. And in one way or another, death affects all aspects of our lives. Death is the great interruption that we face. And so what I want to ask you guys is, have you ever had happen to you what happened to me in that story that I told? Where you're just going about your life, doing whatever it is you would normally be doing, having a normal day, and then you get that phone call. Or you receive that news, that friend, that loved one, that family member is gone. And much like what I experienced, it feels like reality comes crashing down. And one of the best ways I can describe it is it's like everything I once knew was like sand slipping through my fingers, and it felt like the tighter I tried to grab on, the faster it slipped through my fingertips. It felt like I had nothing to grab onto. Have you ever felt that way thanks to the interruption of death? And when that happens, when death interrupts our lives, from that moment on, everything is interrupted. Nothing can ever be exactly the same as it was before we got that news. Because how could it possibly ever be the same? Someone that we loved, who was once a part of our life, is gone. And receiving that news about death interrupting our lives, it always interrupts and it always disorients, even when the death is quote-unquote expected. My grandfather's health had been deteriorating for some time leading up to his death, but that didn't make it any easier to receive that phone call from my dad. It didn't make that moment any easier at all. The other reason that death is such a significant interrupter is because it affects us both in the immediate short term, but also in the long term. Because in the short term, when we first get that news, it really doesn't matter what we're doing, right? We could be in the middle of a normal day at our job. We could be in a big meeting that we've had scheduled for months. We could be on a vacation that we've been saving up for years. When we receive that news that death has interrupted our lives, we have no choice but to put that thing aside and confront the interruption of death. But then death affects us in the long term because those of us left behind, we have to figure out, what do our lives look like without this person in our life? How do I keep on living without this person who I cared about so much? The other thing that the interruption of death can do is it can cause us to be angry at God for taking someone that we loved away from us. And we end up in this place where we have both immense grief and sadness about this death and also genuine anger at our God. And those two things, they don't mix well, and they leave us in a place of despair. And I haven't even mentioned the way that we have to deal with the interruption of death personally. It's no secret that we are finite beings who are confronted with death, and that often keeps us from being able to do and being able to accomplish all that we might hope to do and accomplish in our lives. That's scary and disorienting enough in its own right. No other interruption affects us like death. And I know this isn't the most fun topic to talk about, and believe me, there are other things I would rather talk about with you guys, especially the last time I'm speaking to you for 9 months. But I can't, in good conscience, prepare a series that addresses the interruptions that we face without addressing the most significant interruption that we face in our lives. And so if any of the emotions or the feelings or anything like that I was just talking about resonate with you at all, I can promise you that this passage is going to be uplifting for you. I know that it's one that I needed to hear. I have dealt with the interruption of death much more up close and personally than I had intended to this summer. And so this passage is definitely one that I needed to hear. So we're going to be at the end of the Gospel of Mark today, in chapters 15 and 16. As it says on the screen here, we're going to be starting in chapter 15, verse 25. Before we hop into that, though, I want to give some quick background, because when I read that first verse compared to what we were in last week, it's going to be like, whoa, how did we get here? So last week, Scott talked about a story where Jesus heals a blind man. And at that point, Jesus was still in the midst of his ministry. Well, after that happens, Jesus, not long after that, makes his way to Jerusalem. And on his way into Jerusalem, Jesus is hailed as a king. So obviously, this is very upsetting to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. So they conspire against him. They use the influence that they have, and they bring Jesus before a Roman judge named Pilate. And Pilate, like any good judge, hears out both sides. He hears out what the chief priest has to say. He asks Jesus his side of the story, and Jesus doesn't say much if you read the account. But surprisingly, Pilate actually finds Jesus not guilty. But then, like a bad judge, Pilate caves to the political pressure that the chief priests have. And the chief priests have also riled up a crowd and turned them against Jesus. And so Pilate orders that Jesus be beaten and that Jesus be crucified. So that's where we're at. I still would encourage you to go back and read those 5 or so chapters in between where we left off last week and now, but that just explains how we got here. So with that being said, starting in Mark chapter 15, verse 25. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." Skipping ahead to verse 33. At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And at 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing near heard this, they said, "Listen, he's calling Elijah." Someone ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down," he said. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." Some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the Younger, and of Joseph, and Salome. In Galilee, these women had followed him and cared for his needs. Many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem were also there. And so it's in this story that we see Jesus face the interruption of death himself. And so I want to take what I said at the beginning of this sermon, that death is the single greatest interruption that we face in our lives, and I want to add to it. Death is the single greatest interruption that we face, and Jesus himself was not exempt from this interruption. After reading this story, it couldn't be more clear that Jesus gets what we go through when it comes to the interruption of death. See, this isn't just a story. This is a real thing that Jesus really experienced. He experienced all of the anguish and the anger and the disorientation that we do when we come face to face with death. Just look at Jesus' words in verse 34. My God, why have you forsaken me?" Those are the words of a man who is experiencing death in a way that is just as real and as intense and as scary as the way that we experience it. Jesus understood the interruption of death and all the fear and the anxiety and the disorientation that comes from it. We serve a God who came to earth, and he himself endured the most significant and difficult interruption that we face. And there is real pain, real anguish, and real death in what Jesus experienced. And so it's important that we not just know this in our minds on an intellectual level, but that we truly grasp this idea. Because what happened to Jesus when he died on the cross is more than just a story. It's not just ink on a piece of paper. It is a reality. It is a real thing that actually happened. And so know that before we go any further. Though death is the single greatest interruption that we face, Jesus himself was not exempt from it. Jesus gets the interruption of death. But further, we serve a God who, during his time on earth, he had friends who were present and had to watch as he died. In verse 40 and 41, we see these women: Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and Salome, along with many other unnamed women who had come with Jesus to Jerusalem. And these women, specifically the three named ones, they had traveled with Jesus, they had cared for his needs, they knew Jesus, Jesus knew them, but most importantly, they just loved Jesus. They loved him like a friend. And now they've just had to watch this person that they loved and who they'd cared for a long time die. I've never been physically present with somebody whenever they passed away. I'm sure that some of you have had that experience, but based on just how difficult it was for me to receive a phone call about my grandfather passing away, I can only imagine what it was like for these women to have to watch as this person that they cared about died. If anyone gets that feeling that we experience of receiving that news of someone dying, it's these women. Because they've stuck it out with Jesus, and they were a part of his ministry through thick and thin, and now Jesus is dead. And they have to figure out what their lives look like without him in it. And so we can sympathize with these women, and they can sympathize with us. And then in the days that follow, these women they're trying to come to terms with Jesus' death. And so we're going to continue in Mark 16:1 and see what these women do next. Mark 16, chapter 1. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. And so Mark tells us that they intend to just go to the place where Jesus is laid and anoint his body with spices. Now, we don't do that practice anymore of anointing someone's body with spices, but the underlying sentiment of visiting the place where someone that we loved is buried is certainly something that we do and certainly something that we can relate to. And we do it because we are just trying to make sense of our lives after we've lost somebody that we loved. We know that we can't actually be with that person in the sense that we wish we could, and so we do the next best thing, and we travel out to wherever it is they're buried, and we pay our respect. This is something I got to do earlier this summer for a good dear friend of mine who had passed away a year and a half ago, and my life has been harder without her in it in this last year and a half, but visiting the place where she was buried was a very meaningful and impactful experience for me. And so that's just exactly what the women in this story are doing. They're going to the spot where Jesus has been laid in a tomb because they can't just let Jesus go. He meant way too much to them. They loved him too much. But I also have to imagine that this isn't the first time that they visited the tomb of someone that they loved who had died. And they know how these things go because their experience with death was very similar to ours. And they didn't expect their trip to Jesus' tomb to be any different. What they expected was to go to Jesus' tomb, find his dead body there, anoint that dead body with spices, and leave with the dead body still in the tomb. But let's read in Mark 16, verse 2, about what they found instead. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb. And they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And so what the women in this story experience is the exact opposite of what they expected. Instead of being greeted by a dead body, they're greeted by an empty tomb with a man whom they've never met, who's dressed in all white, and that man tells them, "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him." In other words, this mysterious man is saying to them, "I know that your lives were significantly interrupted by this death, and I know that you expected this death to play out exactly the same way that death had previously played out in your life. But that's not the case here. That's not the case with this death. This death is different because the once dead body you were looking for is not here." And this is so incredible because these women, they came to Jesus' tomb with all sorts of expectations. They probably expected to find guards there. Mark tells us they at least expected to have trouble rolling the stone away. But most importantly, they expected to find Jesus' fully dead body in that tomb, waiting to be anointed with spices. But nobody expected no body. Nobody, not even these women, expected to find no body in that tomb. And we can tell that they're completely shocked because they're terrified when that's what they find. What they encountered when they went to Jesus' tomb was not what they expected. And then look at what the man in white tells them after telling them that Jesus has risen. He says, "But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." I want you to just think about for a second what it would be like to hear that if you're one of these women. Because every other death they've experienced has involved a permanent goodbye. Every other time that their life has been interrupted by death up to this point, it involved them permanently saying goodbye to someone that they loved. And yet here's this man dressed in all white, sitting in Jesus' empty tomb, and he tells these women, "You need to go because Jesus is going to see you soon." Jesus takes a permanent goodbye and turns it into "see you soon." Jesus takes this permanent interruption of death and single-handedly turns it into a temporary one. And if that's not incredible enough, what happens to Jesus and what Jesus does in this story, it's only a first fruits of what's to come for those who believe. And so let me make that abundantly clear. For the believer, Jesus robs death of its ability to be a permanent interruption. Because of Jesus, death doesn't get the final word over any of us. The ability to take an interruption as permanent as death and make it temporary is available to all who believe. But that's not to say that death doesn't continue to impact us deeply. And it's not to say that we don't continue to be interrupted by death. There's a famous preacher whose name is Thomas Long, and he says that when you go to a funeral, there's actually two preachers present. The first preacher is the one you'd expect, the one who proclaims the gospel in the midst of that death. But the second preacher is death. And what's so difficult in that moment where we're all gathered and we're all interrupted by this death and we're at this funeral is it seems like death has all the evidence. Because you look around and you see people dressed in black, you see tears on people's faces, you see a casket with a body in it, and all of that evidence makes dealing with the interruption of death really hard because it makes it seem like death gets the final word. I had the privilege, the absolute privilege, of speaking at my grandfather's funeral several months ago. But I will tell you, that's whenever what Thomas Long has said about there being two preachers became clear. Because you realize what you're up against, and you realize the evidence that death has. Because on my own face, I could feel tears, and I could feel a tightness in my chest. But we have access to the only piece of evidence that matters, and that is in Mark 16:6, a man dressed in white uttered these four simple words, "He is not here." It's because of those four words that I know that I will see my papa again. It's because of those four words that despite of how difficult that funeral was, I left with significant hope because my papa knew and he cherished the empty tomb. And I say that because there will be another funeral, and there will be another phone call with the news about our lives being interrupted by death. And obviously, that's not something that I wish on any of us, but I'm not naive to the fact that this summer isn't the last time that my life will be interrupted by death. And so when you're in that moment that you're next interrupted by death and you're at that funeral and you're faced with those two preachers, death and the gospel, and you look around, it certainly seems like death has all the evidence between the casket, the way people are dressed, the tears on your face. Remember in that moment that Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome went to Jesus' tomb expecting to find a dead body, and instead they found an empty tomb with a man dressed in white who said, "He is not here." And when that news was delivered, it became clear that Jesus had taken what was once the permanent interruption of death and turned it into a temporary one. And that means that Jesus gets the final word, not death. For the believer, Jesus robs death of its ability to be a permanent interruption. Death is the ultimate interruption that we face, and Jesus renders it ultimately powerless over us. And it's because of those 4 words uttered in Jesus' empty tomb, "He is not here." It's because of those 4 words that Paul in 1 Corinthians was able to so confidently write after spending a whole chapter talking about Jesus and the resurrection that he wrote, "Where, O death, is your victory? Where, O death, is your sting?" And I will tell you, and Paul will tell you, that you don't speak that boldly to an enemy as powerful as death unless you know that the battle has already been won. And you don't speak that boldly to an interrupting force as strong as death unless you know that Jesus has taken what was once a permanent interruption and made it a temporary one. For the believer, Jesus robs death of its ability to be a permanent interruption. Let that be the reality that we cling to the next time that we are face to face with the interruption of death. I'm going to pray for us. After I do, we're going to sing a song, and myself and the ministers will be up here at the front, and the shepherds will be at the doors. And if you need prayer for anything, please come forward. If you have experienced the interruption of death and you need something firm to hold on to, let us be that for you. Let me pray for you. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for the gift of your Son who came down and took what was once such a strong and permanent interruption and made it a temporary one. God, I pray that in that moment when we receive that news, God, and it feels like things are spinning out of control around us, that you bring that to the forefront of our minds, that we can be grounded in the truth of the resurrection and the truth that your Son took what was once a permanent interruption for us and made it a temporary one. God, I thank you for this church. I thank you for the people in it. It's in your Son's name I pray. Amen.